Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Paideia Today. I am Dr. Friesen, and I'm joined here by my colleague, Dr. Scott Masson. And today we're going to be talking about Greek drama, and we're going to focus particularly on Greek tragedy, and one Greek tragedy in particular, one which has received a lot of attention in the past, which is Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. In order to understand what's going on with Oedipus Rex and Greek tragedy more broadly speaking, we need to understand some of the context of Greek drama, and that is to an overwhelming degree informed by one man, that is Aristotle. And Aristotle had a number of stipulations when it came to Greek drama, which have proved not only highly influential to the nature of Greek drama itself and our understanding of it, but to the Western tradition of drama thereafter for the next over 2,000 years. And he has 7 points in particular that he outlines. And Scott, do you want to take us very briefly through those 7 points?
Sure. So the first point is that it's mimetic. And I think I probably need to say a little bit about mimetic. When he says mimetic and talks about mimesis, he's talking about representing objects and events in the world. And the reason he says that is because philosophy represents ideas, so not objects or events in the world. So he's distinguishing as a philosopher between what poetry does and what philosophy does. He also says that human beings are naturally drawn to imitate things. They love imitation. And so poetry has this strong appeal on us because of that.
You have actually a number of thinkers after Aristotle who talk about mimesis and the mimetic impulse. And just to flesh it out a little bit more, this is an impulse. René Girard in recent times has probably been the most significant thinker on this front. And he notes that when we encounter something that we find dramatically powerful, when we find something or encounter something aesthetically pleasing and deeply moving, or even an idea that's tremendously interesting at the purely intellectual level, it doesn't have to be art, it can be just an idea. Immediately, oftentimes at the subconscious level, we try to, in some way, draw near to that. We try to associate ourselves with that. We try to commune with that. We try to imitate that. Mises, of course, supplies us with our modern notion of imitation. And so when your favorite song comes on the radio or something like this, what's the first thing you do, especially if you're alone in the car? You sing along to it. Why? Because you're imitating it. You want to somehow associate and draw near to that song, and so you identify with it by participating in the action of performing the music which you love. You see a little kid he watches a superhero movie. What's the first thing he does as soon as the movie's done? He runs outside and he pretends to be the hero who has so
That's
impressed
true.
him, doing all these sorts of things. There's a myriad of ways in which the human mind, either implicitly or explicitly, wants to imitate that which it finds deeply moving. And drama gives it a very powerful venue in which to apprehend something like this.
The other thing that's embedded in this or assumed by Aristotle is that art has a moral function.
Yes.
And so the imitation here, it's imitating things that are going to be morally instructive. I only say that because some people have stated, at least particularly in the late 19th century, that art is for art's sake and it has no moral function per se. And Aristotle would never consider that.
No, indeed, most later thinkers would have probably vehemently disagreed with
Oh,
that.
they've been very angry about it,
Whether
for
it's
sure.
Sydney or what have you, but you're probably talking about the assertions here of Oscar Wilde and Walter
Yeah.
and people in that venue.
But that's spoken in a particular context. We'll get to that stuff when we get to it, I guess. But
yeah.
So 7 characteristics. So it's mimetic. It is serious. When he says that it's serious, he's contrasting it with the comedy. Its seriousness then is reflected in the characters that it depicts. So it depicts aristocrats, kings, and so forth. So here we're going to be talking in the next episode about one particular, Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus Rex, however you want to present it, Oedipus the king. He is a figure that is superior to us in some ways. That is what sets him out as a tragic hero, or as the possibility of having a tragic heroism, whereas comic figures are figures that are lower than us in the station of life, so we look down on them and we can laugh at them, whereas a tragic figures are our social superiors. We look up to them and we can feel their fall when they do fall. So that's the second part.
Yeah, they're heroic, and again nowadays with oftentimes egalitarian sort of impulses informing how we see such characters. We think somehow that they are different, fundamentally different than us, but this is not the case. As with the hero in the epic, the tragic hero, yes, he or she is greater than us, they're smarter than us, they're more virtuous than us, they're more powerful than us, they are more noble than us in a number of different ways. That doesn't mean they're different. It means that they carry the burden of being human at a greater level, but in the same way that all of us share. So there's a universalism that is implicit in these great heroes. They are like us. They're simply greater and more dramatic than us. And so we can see the problems of being human played out more powerfully and more dramatically in them. But we have to admire the person who is going to undergo the tragic fall. And that's absolutely vital. You can't revile this person. You have to like this person, and so it has to hurt when they come to ruin.
I mean, the reason that we are saying that here, and you're emphasizing it, and rightly so, is there is a militant egalitarianism in our day that really resists it and talks about tragedy, even in relation to the common man.
Yes.
And that is really antithetical to the way the Greeks look at these things. But in American music and in drama of the 20th century, there's a great deal of reference to the tragedy of the common man, Aaron Copland's Fanfare of the Common Man, all that sort of stuff. So there's a great deal of revolutionary ideology embedded in that. And Aristotle simply would find that baffling.
Yeah, most generations until recent times would have found that very baffling.
Well, also because with that, there's a moral equivalence that goes with that and a downgrading of moral. So if there's no such thing as nobility, there's no such thing as virtue.
Yes.
And that can't be represented in a person that we look up to, then the very possibility of a life of virtue and excellence is impossible. So if everything's been leveled by not just hierarchy, but in moral doings, then it's just, it all collapses on itself.
We live in a profoundly comedic age, and I say that in a carefully pejorative sense.
I don't know, because that has to have a sense of lower, though, then, Bill, doesn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, we seem to be plumbing the depths when it comes to many sort of cultural icons. I mean, if we've got, a great play that's emblematic of the 20th century, is it not Waiting for Godot? It's are we even capable of writing tragedy anymore, thinking in tragic terms, ascribing to this level of lofty, noble virtues? It seems sometimes that the best we can muster here is cheap irony, if not the belly laughs of pure ridicule. Is that who we have become? What would Aristotle make of the drama of our age? But in any event, yeah, you're right. The tragic hero is absolutely central to this and has been central to this up until recent times. And we do well. In fact, we must remember that when we encounter Greek drama. And when we're reading Greek comedy, that it's perhaps not beside the point that the great comedic age of Greek drama followed after the great tragic age of Greek drama. And many people saw this as a decay of Greek culture more generally, as indicative of a decay of Greek culture and Greek society.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
From there, we move into the mere bureaucracy and pedantry of the Hellenistic era, when they didn't really turn out anything of value.
Yeah.
But again,
so those features, so it's mimetic, it's serious, and then the other five or at least four of the five are more technical. The story has an appropriate length. Aristotle will talk about in the neoclassical age, they'll really connect these to the unities of time, place, and action. So it tends to take place over a short space of time, say 24 hours, and in one particular venue, even though people are going off stage to different places and you have a reference to past events and future events and so forth. It all takes place within a short space of time, place, and action. So that it's an appropriate length, though. It doesn't go on too long. It's going to be performed on the stage.
Well, actually, this is interesting, because then when you encounter later playwrights, very good playwrights like Shakespeare, when he gets to The Winter's Tale, he is deliberately violating and violating and
Yeah.
violating the unities. That you have to
Yeah,
understand
yeah,
the
yeah.
tradition.
Well, but those unities are declared by the neoclassical age after Shakespeare.
Right.
And Shakespeare doesn't fit them, which is what some of those that object to the neoclassical impositions say. They say, but Shakespeare is the demonstration that these unities that you say are true of all art are not true of all art, because look at Shakespeare. And there is an ongoing discussion there, and that's the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns. In the French Academy, precisely that. There's some that say the ancients are our role models in all things, and the moderns are pointing to Mr. Shakespeare, and he says, well, he breaks all those rules, so
That's right.
so much for your rules. Right?
Yes, I agree. No, that's neoclassicism in a nutshell. After 1660, this rolls on into England. It becomes the dominant dramatic form. But posterity seems to nevertheless assume that the age that came before in English drama is a superior age, indeed is the golden age. And Shakespeare, of course, is the figurehead there of that.
Yeah. Let me go through the final ones. It contains rhythm and harmony. I won't get into the specifics there, that we'll talk about odes and epodes and all that sort of thing, and strophe and antistrophe. Fifthly, the rhythm and harmony have different combinations in different parts of the tragedy. He talks about that. So these are more technical observations. Sixthly, and this is probably important, that it's performed rather than narrated. An epic, which we've just been dealing with in past episodes, those are narrated. This is, on the other hand, performed. And seventh, and finally, it arouses feelings of pity and fear in the audience and purges them through catharsis.
And this is going to be interesting also when it comes to the play Oedipus Rex, because a large part of the tragedy there arises from the very fact that people gave in to their fears and had pity. The main character, the protagonist, Oedipus, is spared so that he might commit his unspeakable crimes precisely because the shepherd had pity on him. Pity was not, it seems like the friend of the human condition. It is not the friend of the human condition in Oedipus Rex. The assessment probably would have been better had he had died than done these heinous, awful things.
Yeah, but that wasn't an option for him. Nope. So those are the 7 characteristics, but those aren't Aristotle also speaks of 6 parts. The first 2 are really important, but I'll list all 6. So plot, character, thought, diction, melody, and spectacle. And the plot and the character are the most important parts of the tragedy, says Aristotle. So those are the basic features of the...
Yeah, and this is maybe a good point to mention, that another incredibly influential aspect of plot that has been in place ever since Aristotle said this. Aristotle distinguished 2 forms of plot. He had a simple and complex plot. Mm-hmm. And the simple plot was the plot where every action that occurred in it necessarily, and that's the word that he would use, necessarily conduces to the next thing that happens, the action, step by step by step. It's not episodic in that sense. Episodic is bad for Aristotle if you have an episodic plot. This is a plot where some of the occurrences are necessary to forwarding the action of the plot, and other stuff can be taken out without doing any damage whatsoever to it. Aristotle said you don't want that. That's a very unprofessional way to put together a play. It's a very unprofessional way to put together a plot, full stop. And then he points out various examples of how this is done well.
And the listeners or watchers here who are thinking about this, when you go then and watch Oedipus, try and think about removing a section from it and see what would happen. Just contemplate, if you just pulled these lines out, what would happen in the play? You just can't do it.
It would just collapse. By way of contrast, if you look at, I mentioned Waiting for Godot earlier, the whole thing is an aside, as it were. There's nothing leads from nothing. It's complete incoherence. You can remove at will any section of Waiting for Godot, and it'll still make the same sense, which is to say no sense at all, as it did otherwise.
So we started off with just Aristotle's summary in his Poetics of what a tragedy is, and he's going to talk about this Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus Rex, however you want to present it. The one's the Greek form, the other's the Roman. From Sophocles as the best example of the tragedy. Mm-hmm. But why don't we talk about religious background and so forth, the backdrop here? Do you want to say something about that? where it
Yeah.
originated? Because it's not, it's relatively recent in terms of, we've been talking about the epic. When Homer's writing, there are no tragedies, right?
No, no, not that
So
we know of.
when do they arise, and what are the features of it?
Well, one of the things I find most fascinating, at least about Western drama, is that it is intertwined, I think, inextricably with the religious impulse. And we
Mm.
see this, of course, very dramatically, excuse the pun, with Greek drama. It arises as far as we can tell, and there's a lot of guesswork here, quite frankly. We have to operate off of inferences and backhand
Absolutely.
references and what have
Yep.
you. It seems to arise from the cult of Dionysus and the rituals that were involved with that. And there's no sort of standard orthodoxy. The Greeks weren't concerned with orthodoxy on that level. So they had different ways of doing dramatic business during such rituals. But we have this thing called the dithyrambic chorus. Best we can make out, it involved approximately 50 men or boys dancing in a circle around a central figure who would in time become the chorus. And the central figure would narrate some tale, dramatic tale. He would dramatize it from the various myths of Dionysus and things that were germane to him. So there was a narrating or storytelling impulse right at the beginning. It seemed to involve dance, so there was a degree of performance already implicit in it.
Yep.
The narration in time became more and more acted out. These are features of the dithyrambic chorus that we can trace from approximately the 6th century BC. So we're right at the beginning of Greek tragedy, but Greek tragedy really sort of takes on a more coherent, structured, systematic form right around 510, 520, probably during the reign of Pisistratus, the tyrant,
Yep.
in Athens. And he establishes, or it is established in Athens at this time, the Greater Dionysia. This is the dramatic religious festival, and
Right.
they're simultaneous.
Yep.
You can't take one out of the other.
Right.
And in
Who is Dionysus again exactly, and how is?
Dionysus is, well, depending on who you talk to, certainly he's the god of wine. He's the god of many things in the wild. Usually the cult of Dionysus, the rituals would be performed outside of the polis in wild places. Some people have theorized that he's bound up with the cult of Pan. I'm not sure how much credence I give to that, but nevertheless, there it is. Is there some conflation? I don't
Also
know.
poetry, right?
Also poetry, initially poetry. And it's important to notice also, Nietzsche makes a great point of this here, that his cult in many respects is taken over by the cult of Apollo as time goes on. And Apollo
Yeah, he
becomes the
writes that
god
in
of
the Death of
poetry.
Tragedy, right?
That's right. So Dionysus is the god of poetry at certain points, but then and drama. But then this shifts over to Apollo, and Apollo seems to take over, and he imposes on poetic and dramatic traditions a completely, maybe even antithetical spirit, if you will. So there's a tremendous amount of poise and control in the poetry of Apollo. And this is bound up with the hymns to Apollo versus the hymns to Dionysus. The hymns
Right.
to Dionysus are wild and ecstatic, and they involve dance. They're very intensely charismatic. There's very much a sense of danger about them as well. These are dangerous times. This is a kind of an interstitial place where man and wild and nature and sin and goodness and virtue and all these things sort of come together in wild, dimly understood ways. Whereas around the cult of Apollo, you have tremendous control. These hymns to Apollo, they're very poised, they're very structured, they're very formal, they're very directed. And Nietzsche insisted that these two impulses were very much in conflict with each other artistically in the Western imagination, and he wanted to return to the Dionysian.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The other thing about Dionysus is when we looked at Homer's pantheon of gods, there's no mention of Dionysus. So he's a late comer on the Greek.
Yeah. Some people have theorized that he's a cult that was imported from the north. Some people have talked about Thebes, or even gone beyond that and said it was perhaps a Thracian importation. The Greeks borrowed stuff unapologetically.
So did the Romans. Polytheism,
yes, exactly.
You can add as many gods as you want, it doesn't matter.
No, and they had no pretensions about being the originators of many of these things here. But when they saw something that took their imagination, they happily borrowed it and adapted it to Greek purposes. And the Romans do the same on an even bigger scale.
The other aspect of Dionysus, which you didn't mention, is the sexual orgiastic
yes.
violence that goes with the Bacchanalia and so forth, right?
Yeah, because I mean, tragedy, as some people might already know, means perhaps absurdly to our ears, goat song. It's what it is. It's a goat song. How is this a goat song? Well, the
The
goat,
tragos is a goat, right?
yes. And so, goat, the figure of the goat is, again, a central sort of symbol to Dionysian cult. This ties into sacrifices made to Dionysus. Dionysus somehow, nevertheless, seems to be bound up with this notion of the expurgation of sins. The musical aspect also, Aristotle mentions rhythm and harmony. I want to talk very quickly about that as well.
Yeah, please.
Greek culture, we tend to forget because we've lost all records of it for the most part, was an intensely musical culture. And we forget this, and it infuses every aspect of their conscious and subconscious day-to-day life. A lot of their words, musical terms for drama, for music, for poetry and stuff like this also very quickly become synonyms for social activities. So, it's not just that harmony exists in music or the performance of a tragedy or something like this. Harmony also exists between people on a social level. And we get that kind of conflation of harmony in two senses here, social and musical, from the Greeks. But we do this with other things, or they did this with other things as well. So the notion of human communing with human to them is deeply and intrinsically musical in a way that it wouldn't necessarily be to us. And I think we tend to forget that. That's something that's kind of silent in the background of Greek tragedy. So I think we really need to sort of keep that in mind. To me, one of my great regrets is that we've lost all records of Greek music. We know that
Yeah, but we certainly know that it was held to be one of the most important arts as part of education, right? It was one of the seven liberal arts, in fact. And Pythagoras thought it was, vitally important. He connected it to number. It's an audible representation of an invisible realm, but
yeah.
it's where beauty connects with truth, right?
Yeah, and it's got celestial connotations about it as well, because there are mathematical relations
Right.
between the heavenly bodies, and of course, if there are mathematical relations between the heavenly bodies, then there is music in the heavens, and there we can move into a discussion about the music of the spheres. There's an anecdote actually that maybe I should mention at this point, and it's almost undoubtedly anachronistic and apocryphal and all that stuff. But the anecdote was that one day Pythagoras was walking down the street, as Pythagoras does, and he was going past a blacksmith shop where a number of blacksmiths were all simultaneously banging away on a piece of metal with hammers. And when two of the hammers struck simultaneously, there arose a relationship between the two sounds, which immediately, at a deep visceral level to Pythagoras, were beautiful. And Pythagoras, being who he was, ran in and he had a look at the hammers and he pushed the guys out of the way. And he discovered that when a hammer of one weight and another hammer of exactly double the weight was struck, there was a harmony that rose between the two bangs, the tings, if you will. And so immediately he ran back to wherever he did his experimentation. He drew wires of particular length and he measured the lengths and looked at the mathematical relationships between them. And he discovered when you pluck those two wires, or you've got one and another one at 2/3 of the length, another harmonic sound arose. And from this, it is said, he developed this notion that beauty is a proportional relationship, in this case, an auditory proportional relationship. And that's what, if you just mess around with the forms and proportion of the forms, beauty arises. And this notion has remained in Western aesthetics while we still studied aesthetics. We don't really study aesthetics anymore philosophically. But it was a regular go-to starting point for the discussion of the origins of beauty. What makes beautiful things beautiful? And Pythagoras is one of the founding fathers of this discussion.
And it gets brought into our culture through Christianity.
Yes.
There.
And the last real big thinker on this is, I think, Clive Bell, writing around the turn of the century. And he plagiarized Pythagoras like crazy and a bunch of other previous thinkers, but he was seen as an original figure on this front. He wasn't original at all. This is a very old discussion.
So this festival was around, so Pisistratus, early, around 500.
Yep.
In Athens, we're primarily going to talk about three Athenian dramatists.
We've got Aeschylus, we've got Sophocles, and we've got Euripides.
Euripides in that order as well.
Yep.
Aeschylus being the first. And
Aeschylus brings in that second actor. So you've got the guy in the middle, and he's acting, and perhaps he's not acting, he's narrating, and perhaps he was acting as well. We don't know. Records don't tell us.
Well, so there were thousands of plays. We've got 30 full plays left.
That's
So
correct.
when you
Yeah.
say we're guessing, that's why.
What we've lost, it's almost incalculable. I heard one figure saying that of Greek literature, less than 0.1% survives to us.
Right.
And let's hope that what survived to us survived because it was good, and hopefully the rest was dross.
Well, what
There's no
survived
way of
is more substantial in the field of literature and history and philosophy than it is in what the anthropologists use to make their sweeping conclusions. So I'm satisfied that we can say at least something on the basis
yeah.
of Western culture through these realms, as opposed to, as I say, anthropologists will say the things based on a little bit of bone that they find in a pile of others.
But I have heard it said that we've lost something in the area of 11,000 Greek dramatic pieces, and that all we've got left is something like 30 tragedies, and I think something in the area of 10 comedies. We've got only fragments of satyr plays left to us. So we've lost the vast bulk of it. It's just the way it is. So then when Sophocles, the writer of Oedipus Rex, comes along, he adds a third actor, and this adds tremendous flexibility all of a sudden to what's actually happening on stage. And this to them was quite novel. And thereafter, of course, we follow with the third great Greek dramatist of whom we know, who is Euripides. But Scott, do you want to say a little bit about what you'd actually be looking at when you're actually watching an original Greek play on the stage?
They were performed alongside these religious festivals. They were performed in three parts, so they tended to be three plays. So in this case, the one we're looking at, Oedipus Tyrannus, was played alongside a play called Antigone and Oedipus at Colonus, and then the little goat play at the end of it. So those were features of it, and there were prizes awarded to the winner of the dramatic festival, just like there were at the Olympic Games and so forth. In Athens, the theater was part of the Acropolis, so the high part of the city, and that was the Dionysian precinct. That seemed to be of particular significance to the city of Athens, the religious festivals that were connected to drama, and in a sense, it speaks to the esteem with which drama was held there. And maybe this is part of the backdrop for Plato's animosity towards the poets, is that they're up in the Acropolis at the top of the city, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a certain point where somebody asks of a certain play, what has this got to do with Dionysus? In other words, what has this play got to do with religion? So we can immediately see that they had an anticipation that this drama was deeply and intrinsically religious, and as soon as it moved away from its religious fundamental core, people began to be upset by this. This was something that disturbed them. Also, we have to remember that in terms of the staging, there would have been a procession, a festival procession that would have led to
Right.
the theater. Oftentimes, we hear that they would take the actual statue of Dionysus from his temple right into the theater. So Dionysus, as it were, in symbolic form, was actually attending and watching the drama that was in his honor.
And the theater was an amphitheater, and it was built right into the hillside of the Acropolis in this case. So the audience is seated in a semicircle around the dramatic area. In terms of the description of the parts of the theater, there was something called an orchestra, which was a circular zone on the ground in front of them. On either side of them, there was a ramp where the actors would come down onto it, called a parados. Later, a scene was introduced, skene, and that the actors were it was opposite the arena to where the orchestra was, so it was built. These are developments of the theater as it went on. Eventually, there was the skene was like a facade from what we would see like as a modern drama, where you can come in through the sides and so forth. So that was part of what you would see there. And that developed over time, but then they became features of basically every theater had those features, and modern drama is basically the same. It has a stage, as it were, and there's an orchestra pit. It's called an orchestra. Nowadays, musicians play there. Back then, not necessarily. There are people walking around
down there and dance.
That's where the chorus was, basically.
Yeah,
actually.
and the seats around. This was the theatron, from which we get our word theater.
Right, from the Greek word to look.
Yes.
Theatro is to look.
And the acoustics, if you ever get a chance to
Oh, they're
stand
perfect.
in one of these, are absolutely magnificent. You can say things in a normal tone of speaking, and you can hear it in the highest seats quite clearly. It's absolutely magnificent.
And that's even more so because of the masks that they wore.
That's right.
Say something about the masks.
Yeah, masks were formal. I mean, we've got, you know, the comedic and tragic masks as symbols of thespian activity to this very day.
Yeah.
Your actual facial expression and indeed your own personality would not have been a central part of the dramatic experience.
The actor's face, in other words.
That's right. Yeah. So, I
Right.
mean, the notion of theatrical celebrity, which we have, of course, at such a great scale, so much in the popular mind today, would have been again an alien concept to the Greeks. That's a notion that starts during Restoration drama, where we have this idea of celebrity. There is fame to be sure to be had, especially for the person who wins the dramatic competition. But it's fame. It's not celebrity. It's a very different sort of a thing.
Yeah.
By the way, just as an aside, each sort of era of theater comes with its own particular food. You know what the food of the Greek theater was?
No.
Sausages. And these vendors who sold sausages at these things were called botularii, from which we get our word botulism, and also which tells us a little bit about the quality of Greek theater food. And
You know what? No wonder they call it a tragedy. Yeah.
yeah, indeed. And to this day, you know, we serve hot dogs at, you know, in the big stadiums while watching baseball. Now,
Ah,
this is a tradition that goes way back, but
nice.
that's just an aside.
And the other thing about these masks is that they facilitated that projection because, of course, they were wooden masks
Yeah, they would have been sounding boards.
yes. So effectively, they allowed the amplification of the voice. But acting would take place in terms of gesture and also voice
Correct.
rather than, you know, facial expression. So that, again, the physical appearance of the actors was totally irrelevant. Their voice was everything.
Absolutely. And then, of course, we've got the chorus, which is this other very...
And we'll talk about the relation of this as a religious exercise and the nature of the gods and why the features of this particular drama relate to those gods and how we can misunderstand what's going on because we have certain assumptions about the nature of the gods and about our relation to them, which we are often importing into their understanding, and we just totally get it wrong. So we'll leave that to next time, though, because I think it's worthy of broader discussion.
Good. Yeah, absolutely. And we'll maybe talk a little bit also about how the religious aspect gets bled out of Greek drama, and we move into different impulses. When Aristotle's talking about the purpose of tragedy, he's not necessarily talking about a religious purpose anymore. He's doing something else, perhaps, with it at that point. But we'll come to all these things in the next episode.
Okay, good. Thanks, Bill.
All right. Thanks, Scott.